Permadeath is one of Fire Emblem's defining features. Many strategy games allow you to let units hit 0 HP during combat, but this usually means the character is absent for the rest of the battle, but will be good as new for the next one. In Fire Emblem, typically a unit dying is the end of that character's story. You won't hear from them again, and the story will continue on without them. Permadeath has been part of Fire Emblem since the beginning, and it's gone through a few changes over the years. Additionally, the way that Fire Emblem games are designed has changed drastically in ways that impact how people experience and react to permadeath. I'm going to go over what I see as the most major changes to permadeath and how the other design trends of Fire Emblem have impacted permadeath. But first, let's look at what it means for a game to be designed with permadeath in mind. In Fire Emblem, Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light, most characters have no dialogue after their recruitment. There's not much to get invested in beyond character portraits, and even then you're going to have to use your imagination a bit if you're trying to get emotionally invested in guys like these. The game also gives you more units than you know what to do with. You'll regularly recruit new units through to the end of the game, and all told there are 51 characters on the roster. This is because Fire Emblem 1 is designed to accommodate permadeath. It is pretty much expected that you might lose some characters along your journey, and new units become available to replace them. Since players are likely to not be as emotionally attached to units in FE1 and there's a wide array of replacement units, it doesn't feel so bad for a unit to die. If your Ogma dies, for instance, you can always replace him with Caesar or Astrum. This is one of the few Fire Emblem games where I almost never reset for a unit death unless a chapter has gone catastrophically wrong. We can compare this to a more recent game, Fire Emblem Three Houses. Three Houses is all about raising students from 0 to hero. You do all of your recruitment in the first half of the game, and the rest of the game is about raising them through battle, lessons, and monastery actions. By the time you reach the second half of the game, your team is likely set in stone, and each unit has probably received a ton of investment. In contrast, your bench units are probably pretty behind because they aren't joining you in battle, and aren't getting lessons most of the time. The gap between your team and your bench only becomes larger as the game goes on. The consequence of this is that if a unit dies during part 2 of Three Houses, there's never an adequate replacement. Your benched units can often be so far behind that they can't meaningfully contribute without grinding, and there's no new recruits to replace your dead unit with. Even if you did decide to grind a bench warmer up to usable standards by using auxiliary battles to get them experience, they would still be lacking in the month's worth of lessons that you've been pumping into the previous unit. So, if a character dies in Chapter 18 of Three Houses, you have a few options. Spend an obnoxious amount of time grinding a new unit up to usability, accept that your army just got way weaker and move on, or reset the chapter, assuming you're out of Divine Pulses. Most people choose to reset, in part because new players don't know how hard the rest of the game is. If they lost a unit on this map, they might worry they could struggle even more on later maps with one less unit. Better safe than sorry, better to just reset. Fire Emblem games have also recently put a lot of focus on unit characterization, so not only are you harshly punished mechanically by a death in Three Houses, you also no longer get to hear from a character you probably liked a lot since you put them on your team. Basically, in an entry like Fire Emblem 1, losing a character is no big deal. You replace them with a new recruit who's probably a little worse and move on with your day. In Three Houses, you're most likely either resetting or spending a lot of time building up a replacement unit and grieving over your lost friend. Over time, Fire Emblem games have become less designed around permadeath. I would argue the first major blow was Fire Emblem 4's generation system. Losing a character in Generation 1 of Fire Emblem 4 often meant you would miss a pairing and would get a replacement unit in Generation 2 instead of a descendant of 2 of your Generation 1 characters. Replacement units are typically worse than a descendant character with good parents, and there's no way to directly pass down items to replacement units. So losing a unit in Generation 1 is sort of like losing 1.5 units. Still, losing a unit isn't a disaster, and you can get by just fine with Sigurd alone in Part 1 and replacement units in Part 2. Still, losing a unit, particularly in Generation 1, is a little more painful than it was in previous games. Fire Emblem 6 introduced the modern support system in which characters can have conversations with each other, which provides opportunities for more characters to get more screen time and lines of dialogue. Gone were the days of units joining your army and having nothing to say for the rest of the game. Mechanically, this game still supports permadeath well with powerful mid to late game units like Percival and Myrety, as well as a variety of usable late game recruits. Emotionally though, it's so much harder to let a character stay dead when you know their backstory and enjoy their character, compared to some of the earlier entries where some units were little more than their portrait. At this point in the series, it had also become very common for new units to be recruited by other non-lord units, which meant that anytime you had a character die, it meant you might also be missing a character later that character needed to recruit. Fire Emblem 6 also featured several Gaiden chapters, some of which required certain units to survive, so letting a unit die could inadvertently prevent you from getting the good ending to the game. After Fire Emblem 6, things stayed the same for a while in regards to permadeath, up until Fire Emblem Shadow Dragon, which was a remake of the original Fire Emblem. Naturally, it includes lots of replacement units, just like the original did, but it also adds a couple new features. First is a suite of Gaiden chapters that you can access only if you've had a certain number of units die. Each of these Gaiden chapters includes new units for you to recruit, so if you've lost a bunch of units, these guys can help bolster your ranks. And if you lose even more units than that, you also have access to generic replacement units that can fill out your army. So if you're struggling on Shadow Dragon's harder difficulties, the game is more than happy to provide you with the resources you need to keep going. Interestingly, while Shadow Dragon is designed to allow the player to embrace permadeath, it also includes one of the first permadeath mitigation features, mid-map saves. In Shadow Dragon, there are specific points on maps that allow you to create a save. This way, if you need to reset, you don't have to do the whole chapter over, you can just go back to your checkpoint. For players that just aren't interested in permadeath, this makes resetting a lot less painful. Shadow Dragon's sequel, New Mystery of the Emblem, introduced another tool for mitigating permadeath, Casual Mode. A lot of people think this mode came from Awakening since New Mystery never released in the West, but New Mystery did it first. Casual Mode removes permadeath, so if a character hits 0 HP, they come back on the next map feeling fine. Casual Mode has been a mainstay of the series ever since New Mystery, but personally I've never been into it. Even when I'm not in the mood for characters to die, I don't enjoy playing on Casual Mode because it lowers the stakes and simplifies the maps. Casual Mode allows for a lot more mistakes since losing a unit doesn't have significant consequences, and Fire Emblem games just aren't designed for you to be okay with sacrificing units. It's too easy if you can bait enemies and not have to worry about your bait unit dying, or being able to send a flyer over to complete some faraway objective knowing that it's okay if they die. Think about how many maps in Fire Emblem history have a tricky side objective that becomes trivial if you can just send a high mobility unit over to complete it and then die. Still, I appreciate Casual Mode as a way for people that are more interested in the story to have fun with the Fire Emblem game. It's just kind of funny that it came in New Mystery of the Emblem, a game that I really love the gameplay of, but has one of the weaker stories in the franchise. Fire Emblem Fates took Casual Mode one step further with Phoenix Mode. Any unit that died in Phoenix Mode returned to the battlefield after a small period of time. I legitimately don't know anyone that's ever played with Phoenix Mode on. I'm guessing this mode was unpopular as we don't see it in the most recent games despite Casual Mode continuing on. Awakening and Fates are also around the time where units start requiring a lot of investment, which discourages allowing units to die. Getting a unit just the way you want them can involve pairing them with the right partner, using multiple class change seals to get them the skills you want, and more. Outside of Echoes, which was a remake, a character dying has been a major time-consuming setback since Awakening, though these games do still include mid to late game replacement units that can be serviceable if you make a mistake or two. Fire Emblem Echoes added our last permadeath mitigation feature, Mila's Turnwheel. The Turnwheel allows you to go back a few turns to correct mistakes that led to a failed objective or character death. Accidentally leave your Pegasus by a bow user, hit the Turnwheel. Alm got done in by a 1% crit, hit the Turnwheel. This feature returned in 3 houses, although they renamed it to Divine Pulse, and along with map saves, this is actually my favorite means of mitigating permadeath, particularly when you're limited to a few uses of it. I like when permadeath adds stakes to a map, but I dislike having to restart an hour-long map due to one error or a low percent crit. This wasn't a problem in very early games where a unit dying wasn't a huge deal, but I've really hated letting units die since Fire Emblem 4. So Turnwheel mechanics allow me a little more mistake affordance and allows me to adjust if I had a good plan that was foiled by some unlikely RNG. In games like Fire Emblem Fates, if I had a unit die at the end of a long map, I often just turned the game off for a bit. But I haven't had to do that since Echoes introduced the Turnwheel. So that's how permadeath and the game design around permadeath has developed over time for the Fire Emblem franchise. The games have become more and more focused on characterizing every unit in your army and providing players opportunity to customize units, so death has become a lot more punishing. I was interested to see how other players interact with permadeath, so I've been checking out the streams of people playing various Fire Emblem games lately. And what I've witnessed echoes the development of the games. In older games, people are more likely to let units die. People usually reset for their favorite units, but sometimes they'll let a benchwarmer bite the dust. Sometimes you'll even see people doing Iron Man runs of older entries where they don't reset no matter what. For more recent entries, though, people tend to turn permadeath off or reset on any unit death. This makes sense since the newer games punish deaths harder and provide more permadeath mitigation options, but this makes me wonder if permadeath is still a feature that makes sense as the default way to play Fire Emblem. Then again, I'm not sure what alternatives would work better. Some games have tried having characters get injured when they hit 0 HP, either lowering their stats or removing them for a few chapters. I've never seen a great implementation of this. Either the stat penalties are so low that it doesn't really matter, or the penalties are large enough that it acts as something of a death spiral, where struggling players just struggle more because their units keep getting weaker every time one falls in combat. It's possible that a game could be designed around casual mode and maps could be made more difficult to accommodate for the ability to sacrifice units. This would be a major shift in identity for Fire Emblem, but in some ways it feels like that identity shift is already happening as unit customization and social mechanics become a larger part of the series' identity, and the games are more designed around you resetting on unit death anyway. Personally, I really like permadeath, and some of the Fire Emblem games I enjoy the most are the ones where I can let the occasional unit die and keep playing. It helps emulate the feeling of being in a war and can create some organic emotional highlights. Leaving a unit behind that you liked can invoke feelings of loss that you just don't experience if you reset for every death. Ultimately, what I would like to see is the return of larger casts and late-game pre-promotes that can act as replacement units. I love how Fire Emblem lets you get to know and invest in characters in recent entries, and I don't want that to change. But I would like death to be a little less punishing so that it feels reasonable to embrace it from time to time. As Fire Emblem has evolved, permadeath mitigation features make perfect sense to have, but I would appreciate just a little more support for a feature that is so relevant to the history and identity of the franchise. Do you reset for character deaths? What do you think about features like Mila's Turn Wheel and Divine Pulse? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoyed the video, consider hitting the like or subscribe button for more Fire Emblem content.